Hi everyone, I hope you are all doing well this week. I am coming on here today to discuss a topic that has been requested now quite a few times, so I feel like I can't avoid it anymore, although, to be honest, I have been avoiding it a little bit because it's a controversial topic, and I certainly am all about being authentic and being real with my beliefs and opinions, truths that I just see out there, in the evidence, in my clinical experience. I'm not going to shy away from saying what I think, but I'm also not just going to post things just for the shock value or just to stir conflict or stir controversy. That's not how I like to run my online platforms. I really usually just shut down people who are just, trying to poke or just excessively criticize or be extremely dogmatic, or really look at things in a black and white way. I'm not interested in those kinds of online arguments, but I am always open for nuanced and intelligent discussion. And so hopefully that's what we can really spur with this video. So if you have an opinion on this topic and you want to chime in, just please be thoughtful, please be nuanced, and I would love to hear people's thoughts. So that topic is veganism and my perspective on vegan diets, and particularly ethical and moral issues in relation to vegan diets or meat eating. So we are going to dive into that in a moment, but first I will give a short update on what's going on with my business. First of all, I have two amazing clinicians on staff who are taking one-on-one clients. This is Mike and Suzanne. You can read about them on my website. I am kind of shying away, or stepping away, I guess I should say. I'm not shying away. I'm stepping slowly away from taking on new one-on-one clients. And so I can focus more on my intensive coaching programs and all the incredible content that I have planned for you that I'm hoping to be releasing over the next year. I need time to do that, and so I'm focusing on my intensive programs, and I'm having Mike and Suzanne take over for new clients who want to do one-on-one work. So they are still building up their caseloads. Their schedules are pretty open. They've been trained in all my methods. They are both wonderful, wonderful people. Mike is my husband. Suzanne is becoming a fast, close friend after I worked with her daughter a couple of years ago now. And they are fantastic clinicians and ready to work with you one-on-one to get you to your health goals. I am still accepting applications for my intensive coaching programs. I have a immune resilience cohort, which is for people with histamine, mast cell issues, chronic allergies, and high sensitivities. I am currently working on filling up my August cohort, so if you are interested in reserving your spot, these cohorts do fill up pretty fast. And I just have a couple spots left for my brain resilience cohort that is starting in July. So this is for people with mental health issues, high stress, high trauma, chronic fatigue, dysautonomy, or other kinds of nervous system or psychiatric disorders. There are just a couple spots left for the July cohort. So if you are interested in applying, please do that on my website. I would love to have you. And then, of course, my Rebuild Your Histamine pre-recorded course is still open. So if you have histamine mast cell issues, you are looking for a comprehensive guide, but you're not really ready to commit to an intensive 6-month program, my pre-recorded course is probably your best option. It's lifetime access, so it's a really good deal to invest in and then just get access to all my protocols and all my educational videos for life. Okay, so on to the topic. So, as most of you know, I really focus on ancestral dietary patterns and lifestyle patterns in my work because I really believe that species do best when they're in an environment that is evolutionarily congruent, right? So humans really do best if they are living in a way that is at least close to what we evolved in, right? Now, obviously, the modern world is very different from the African savanna where we evolved, but we can do things to make our environments and our day-to-day lives at least more ancestrally congruent. And I truly believe all of my clinical experience, and I think most of the research I see shows that the more incongruence with our evolutionary needs we can make our lives, the healthier that we get, right? This is the same for cats and dogs and all our pets, right? When we feed them things that they did not evolve eating, when we put them in these very artificial environments, they tend to get sick, right? They can tend to develop diseases. So I really think that we find our best health and that we really thrive when we embrace our ancestral origins, and that is not something to overcome or to shy away from. Now, what we see as a universal pattern in ancestral diets is that people eat animal foods. There are no exceptions to this. Right? People will talk about sometimes sex in like ethnic groups in like southern India, for example. These people still eat animal foods, right? They are vegetarians, but they do eat a lot of ghee and yogurt. And so they are still eating animal foods. And this is actually a very unusual case. And this really has only, from what we can tell from the anthropological evidence, only been for the last like 5,000 years, which is actually a very short period of time, evolutionarily speaking. So it is not common. There is like that one kind of exception that we see, and they still eat animal foods. But universally, people are eating meat, they're eating eggs, they're eating seafood, they're eating dairy. And this, not only that, but animal foods are usually considered by people living in more traditional ways, like the highest prized foods, right? Like these are like if you ask people who are living in more traditional contexts, like what their favorite foods are, almost universally they will say meat. And sometimes this is because meat can be a little scarce, right? A lot of people in traditional cultures have been pushed into areas, unfortunately, because of colonialism and globalization, where meat is a little more scarce than it probably would have been for them traditionally. And so it's a big deal when they can get it. So it's very, very prized. They are often considered fertility foods, right? So they are especially prioritized for couples who are trying to get pregnant, and for people who are sick. And so I think we really need to pay attention to that pattern, right? That is not a coincidence. There is a huge amount of evidence that we evolved eating quite a bit of meat. I talk about this in my book. We can analyze the bones of ancient humans, and we can see that the chemical composition of the bones is very similar to apex predators, like wolves and lions. And so it's very likely that we evolved as hunters near the top of the food chain, and really thrived eating a lot of meat. Now, that being said, there are traditional uses for vegan diets. They are used as fasts. They are used as cleanses, and they are used for religious purposes, right? So we will see, for example, like in Buddhist and Christian mystic traditions, people will often eat vegan, right? They will only eat plant foods for often about 40 days, which is a very traditional amount of time to do a fast, right? There is some kind of spiritual significance we see with that number pretty universally across traditions. And so sometimes it's a true fast, right? But that gets pretty intense, like doing a true like water fast for 40 days. So often what you will see to make this more accessible is they will have just a vegan diet for about 40 days, and they consider this a cleansing period. And they've actually done really fascinating studies where they look at people's blood markers before they go into this, religious fast, and after. And people are healthier at the end of it, right? Plants have an incredible amount of medicinal power. Fiber is an extremely cleansing compound in the body. And so there is a utility in these short-term vegan fasts, I would call them. I would not even really call it a diet. I would call it a fast, because it does mimic a fasting state in the body. So I think this is also why when a lot of people go like whole foods plant-based, so to speak, they feel really good for a while, right? Because again, this does have a cleansing effect in the body. There is a utility for these kinds of diets. I have even used vegetarian diets on very rare occasions for my clients who really just needed a cleanse, right? Or maybe we're having a lot of gallbladder issues, a lot of high toxicity issues. You might look up the bean diet and Karen Hurd as well. This is someone that is using basically a diet of all beans to help people who have high levels of toxicity. She actually saved her daughter from acute pesticide poisoning, putting her on a bean diet. So there's nothing wrong with using these tools in the proper way, but we have to look at the ancestral context. And that's really what it is. It's in the context of these religious, spiritual cleanses. So outside of that, people who argue for these more long-term vegan diets, I think they are not really looking clearly at the anthropology, and I think that they are looking at specific clinical research studies that are either epidemiological, meaning they're just like having people food journal basically, and then drawing wildly generalized conclusions from these surveys, right? There's a huge amount of problematic aspects for epidemiological studies, right? There's all sorts of confounding factors that are really impossible to control for. So they're either looking at those kind of studies or they are really not anchored in any kind of ancestral perspective. They have not spent time with traditionally living people, with indigenous people, and they have a really skewed idea of what health looks like around the world. And unfortunately, the blue zone propaganda has not helped with this. And I think this is really, really misguided information. I do have a whole video about the blue zones and my concerns with that research. There is some really important stuff in that research. There are some gems, but I think it has been skewed in a really unfortunate way. Now, that's the health side, right? That's just like the physiological aspect of it. In terms of the moral and ethical aspect, because you will have people who say like, well, yeah, I probably would feel better if I ate meat. Or like, I think, meat can be part of a healthy diet, but it's moral and ethical reasons, why I'm on a vegan diet. Now, some of this is really about like life, death, and suffering, right? Some of this is really getting down to the morals of killing another being in order to eat. And some of it is the environmental aspect. So I will talk a little bit about both. But I think it's important to recognize that if we do not see ourselves as animals, if we do not see ourselves as a part of nature, we can start to draw some very skewed conclusions, right? And I think this is actually a huge part of what is wrong with the modern world, is seeing that we can trump our evolution, or thinking that we can trump our evolution, right? Thinking that we can trump our own physiology, thinking that we can remove ourselves from nature and still be okay, really, like as a species or as individuals. I think this is a slippery slope that can go into some very, very problematic waters. And I think every time we have tried to override nature, every time we have tried to override our natural instincts and our natural environments, we have run into major problems. And I think there is a way to still have progress in terms of science and technology and, philosophy and religion and all these wonderful things that make us human. I think we can continue to progress in all these fields while not removing ourselves from nature, right? While still seeing ourselves as a part of a global ecosystem and as a part of playing an important role, an active role. And if we do not see ourselves as a predator species, right? We are very likely apex predators, evolutionarily speaking. Like we are likely, omnivores with hypercarnivore tendencies, right? Like we can eat omnivore to survive or to enjoy ourselves, but really, like, we physiologically can be considered, apex predators and hypercarnivores. And I don't think it's helpful for anyone to deny that or to try to remove ourselves from that aspect of the food chain. I think things really start to break down when we deny our ancestry and our evolutionary heritage. And I think some of this is our pathological avoidance of suffering, death, and our very skewed concept of what it means to be empathetic, right? And I think we really need to rethink the way we approach these concepts. We cannot avoid suffering and death, right? And I think if we look at the big picture and we look at how avoidance of death and suffering actually ends up leading to more death and suffering, right? It just kind of displaces it. Like, we really can't avoid these natural cycles of life. We can just displace it over somewhere else where we didn't intend it to be, right? And I think that's what tends to happen when you follow the logic through with what actually happens when you start implementing a vegan diet on a global scale for mass groups of people. I don't think not killing another organism inherently means that you are more empathetic, right? Because that organism may starve to death in the wilderness or may be torn apart by wolves, right? And the fact that you decided not to eat something that was slaughtered in a slaughterhouse that was going to die probably through some kind of brutal method anyway, like, again, I just do not see how that elevates you as an empathetic person, instead of trying as much as you can to be a conscious consumer in the role that you were born into, like, evolutionarily, as a part of your birthright. I hope this is all making sense. I'm going to give some examples of this, and I do really encourage people who are struggling with this concept to talk to indigenous people, like, talk to people who come from cultures that are still living traditionally, right? And talk to them about how they feel when they are hunting or they are fishing. I mean, this is a sacred vocation in traditional cultures. Like, hunters are revered, right? And part of it is because you are taking such an active role in maintaining the life and health of a whole community and in enacting your place, in the natural world. Ranchers and homesteaders have a very, very close tie to the animals that they are harvesting. And so I think it's really helpful to talk to them about how it feels. I've never talked to someone in one of those roles that takes what they're doing lightly. They see the weight of it. And they are some of the most grounded, empathetic people that I've often ever talked to. Right. And so I think we really need to expand our idea of what empathy actually means. Right. And it's not sometimes just like, oh, I'm avoiding hurting this other organism. Right. It's a much bigger picture in terms of, like, are you in line with the natural cycles and rhythms of yourself and your environment? So when I was talking about displacing suffering and death, so for example, if you are, not eating meat because you think that you are preventing suffering, by not contributing to the slaughter of an animal, you have to zoom out and look at the big picture. Because when you harvest plants, you are killing animals, right? And so I think this is really important, like, to keep your crops safe. Like, you have to set traps for, vermin, so to speak, right? For animals that are invading the crops, for birds that are stealing the crops. You're trying to, like, prevent them from eating your food. And sometimes that means that animals are going to go hungry, or they're going to get hurt, or they're going to get killed. And even in the harvesting, right? In the harvesting of crops, there are animals that live in the fields where crops are getting harvested, and they are often killed as a part of the harvesting process, right? So, there is really no such thing as avoiding death and suffering when you are engaged in your way of eating, whatever that is. You're just displacing it somewhere else. I would also argue that self-sacrifice is not actually empathy. If you are saying, like, okay, I am not going to eat an animal, but then my health is going to suffer as a consequence, that is some really bizarre self-sacrifice martyrdom that I think is a sign of a imbalanced brain, right? If you are saying, like, I am going to sacrifice my own health and life and well-being, because of my empathy, that is actually not empathy, that is self-hatred, right? And so again, we really have to look at the big picture here of what we're talking about. We don't avoid suffering and death, we just displace it somewhere else. Now, in terms of environmental concerns, I have huge environmental concerns with our entire food system, right? So this includes meat, right? And it includes agriculture. So I get very confused as to why people target meat so heavily with their environmental concerns and ignore the mass damage that comes from large scale mass agriculture, right? Like, we create deserts through large scale farming of plants, right? We create immense environmental destruction from fields of corn and wheat and soybeans, right? Like, these are detrimental to the environment. And I would agree that massive factory farms where they are harvesting animals are probably not great for the environment either, right? But we cannot just pick and choose what we are criticizing. We need to look at the entire food system and see problems with it everywhere, right? And so you cannot compare a factory farmed cow to a regeneratively raised cow on a small farm, just like you cannot compare people who are growing these complex variety of plants together in more traditional kinds of agricultural practices that are more regenerative to the land. You can't compare that to, like, monocrops of wheat for acres and acres and acres that are sprayed with all these horrible pesticides, right? So we definitely need to be concerned about environmental issues, and we need to do the best we can within our own abilities to support people who are trying to shift the food system in these positive ways. But we cannot just pick and choose, right, and go buy our processed vegan foods, right, or our, whatever, exotic plant-based butters and superfoods imported from around the world, and then yell at someone from, like, harvesting a cow like, that was grown, on a farm 5 miles away from them, on pasture. Like, it's just, we really need to expand our concerns for the environment to be more all-encompassing. And so, if you are vegan for environmental reasons, I really encourage you to look deeper into understanding the food system as a whole. And if you are vegan for those moral, ethical reasons I was talking about, I would really encourage you to delve into your concept of empathy and try to step back, as opposed to it just being a knee-jerk concern, like just an emotional, visceral response, to actually really look deeper into the topic and to really try to investigate, like, where you feel resistance to accepting your role as a member of the human species, in the environment of the world that we are born into. Yeah, I hope this video wasn't too meandering or abstract. I would really like to hear people's thoughts if you feel like I'm on the right track with how I'm explaining this, if there is other points that you want to highlight as well, or things that you're confused about. So let's start a really good conversation on this in the comments. I would love to hear people's thoughts. And I will be back on for a video sometime next week.